All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today we're diving into this really fascinating story of evolution that's happening like right before our very eyes, and it's all about this tiny bird called the junco. Now, for years, scientists have known that two populations of these birds are different, but now we're asking a much bigger question. Are they actually becoming an entirely new species? So we're going to walk through this mystery together, following the arc of a pretty brilliant scientific investigation designed to solve it. And this right here, this is the hook. This question reframes everything we thought we knew. We've seen the differences in wing length, in boldness, all these heritable traits. But this question moves us beyond just describing differences. It forces us to ask about the ultimate consequence. It makes you stop and think, what even is a species? So suddenly, this isn't just about adaptation anymore. This is about speciation, the actual process of how new species are born. It totally raises the stakes for the entire investigation. So let's take a look at how this investigation really kicks off this major shift in thinking. The key here is moving from something we're familiar with, adaptation within a species, to this much bigger, more complex idea of how a new species might actually come to be. Okay, so up to this point, a really strong case has been built. We know the UCSD Juncos are different from the mountain Juncos. We know those differences are passed down. And we know it's all tied to natural selection. But this one question you see on the slide? It completely reframes your role. You're not just a biologist documenting change anymore. You're suddenly an evolutionary detective trying to solve a speciation event as it happens. Exactly. And what's so crucial here is that our old tools, measuring wings, observing behavior, they just can't answer this new question. We need a whole new way of thinking. We need to figure out if these two groups are reproductively isolated. Or, to put it simply, are they interbreeding? And that leads us to this fantastic scientific problem. How do you prove a negative? How do you prove they aren't interbreeding? Yeah, and that's a real head-scratcher. How can you possibly prove two groups of birds aren't mixing their genes? Well, the way this investigation handles it is just brilliant. It doesn't throw you into the deep end with complex population genetics. Nope, it starts with a simple, really powerful analogy that pretty much everyone can understand. The paternity test. It's a concept most of us have heard of, right? It takes this really abstract idea of gene flow between populations and makes it incredibly concrete. The question becomes, can we figure out who the father is? This is a great way of building a mental model using a familiar human context, long before we even get to the birds. It's pretty interesting that the investigation starts right here, with a human karyotype. Why not just show us bird chromosomes from the get-go? Because the goal at first isn't to teach us about bird genetics. The goal is to lock in this one fundamental rule of sexual reproduction. You get half from mom, half from dad. This simple 50-50 model is the intellectual tool we're going to need to crack the whole case. We have to make sure that tool is solid in our minds before we try to use it. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. We get this puzzle. We have to look at this diagram and find the father. And the logic is actually pretty simple. You look at the offspring's genetic markers, they're called alleles, you see which ones came from the mom, and you realize the rest had to have come from the dad. You can see the offspring has a couple of markers the mother doesn't have. So you just scan the potential fathers, find the one with that exact combo, and in this case, yep, it's male 3. Case closed. And this just brilliantly illustrates the strategy. By solving a simple puzzle, you really internalize how to use this tool. So the crucial point is, when you get to the real, messy Junco data, you aren't trying to learn the method and analyze the data at the same time. You're just applying a tool you already trust. It's a huge confidence builder. Okay, so we've got our model, we've tested it, it works. Now it's time for the main event. It's time to apply this whole paternity test logic to the big question about the Juncos and see what the real genetic evidence has to say. I love that the investigation kicks this off with a map. It grounds all this abstract genetic data in physical space. These aren't just numbers on a screen. They're real birds from real places. You can see where the scientists took their samples. There's the UCSD campus population, and then right nearby, you've got the mountain populations. And then you get this. This graph is really the heart of the entire investigation. This is the big reveal, the aha moment. It's showing the frequency of one specific genetic marker, allele 208, in all those different populations that we just saw on the map. And the pattern is it's stunningly clear.
In the UCSD population, more than 60% of the birds have this allele. But look at the nearby mountain populations, it's practically zero. So now we can use our paternity test logic. If mountain males were frequently fathering chicks on campus, those chicks would get half their genes from their mountain dads. The gene pools would be mixing. But the data says that's just not happening. This specific allele, which is so common on campus, is staying on campus.
And here, we bring in the actual scientific paper to back it all up. The researchers, using this very same data, came to the exact same conclusion. There is little to no interbreeding. This is the evidence we were looking for. This points to reproductive isolation. So the case seems closed, right? The genetic evidence looks pretty clear-cut. But this is where the investigation gets really, really clever. Just when you feel like you've got the answer, it pulls a twist. Right. It immediately asks us to question the very tool we just used to be successful. Do you think it is ever possible that a child ends up with some DNA that isn't completely identical to the DNA of their parents? It totally undermines that simple 50-50 model, and this is so important. It teaches us that scientific models are useful, but they're not absolute truth. We use simple models to understand the world, and then we make them more complex as we learn more. And here are the pieces to build that more complex model. We get introduced to 3 biological realities that kind of break that simple 50-50 rule. First, you've got mutations, which can create brand new DNA sequences that neither parent had. Second, mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from the mother, never the father. And third, the sex chromosomes, X and Y, well, they're not an equal match.
So now we see that all of our mitochondrial DNA comes straight from our mom. That's definitely not 50-50. And we learn that the Y chromosome is much smaller and carries different genes than the X chromosome. So the elegant simplicity we started with is now being replaced by a more nuanced and, frankly, a more accurate understanding of genetics.
And this creates the absolute perfect cliffhanger. It leaves us with new questions and new tools. We've seen how genetic markers can show reproductive isolation, but now we know that the way those markers get passed down is way more complicated than we thought. This sets the stage perfectly for the next step, where these more complex ideas, like mutation rates, are going to be used to build an even more robust model for common ancestry and something called the molecular clock. So at the end of the day, we're left with this really powerful idea. This investigation isn't just about whether Juncos are becoming a new species. It's about how science actually works. We build a simple model to find an answer, and then, and this is the most important part, we challenge that very model to build an even deeper, better understanding of the world.